The etiquette among storytellers is that you don't tell someone else's written story without asking their permission. But I could not find how to reach Isabel Allende to ask her permission to tell this story. It's in her wonderful collection, The Stories of Eva Luna, published by Bantam. And it is the story of Esther Lucero. I'm doing a retelling, so I urge anyone who likes this story at all to read it in the original. And if you can read it in Spanish, all the better. She's a magnificent writer. One day they brought Esther Lucero in on a stretcher, bleeding like a stuck pig and her eyes terrified. And for the first time anyone could remember, the doctor Angel Sanchez lost his calm. And there was reason for this, because he had been in love with Esther Lucero since she was a child. On that day, he had come in from the jungles, from the last good campaign, with the rest of the men from his group, filthy, caked with mud, bitten by mosquitoes, but happier than he had ever been before or since, with his rifle across his lap, riding in honor on top of the Jeep into town. And the crowds were waving and cheering, and as he looked over the crowd, he saw one little girl who stood out in his eye, waving a little paper flag. She wasn't so little, she was 12. But there was something about her young face and eyes that spoke to him of the beauty already germinating inside her. And he was amazed. The following day, he mounted a search, sure that perhaps such a vision was only malaria or the last of his euphoria after the war. And as they began cleaning up the town, he began going from house to house, searching for this vision. He didn't find her. And then he came to one last house, barely more than a shack. He knocked and no one answered, so he went in. It was one little room. The window was only covered with a curtain. The door was riddled with bullets. There was a door out to the yard on the other side, which was almost like a junkyard, with the refuse of old furniture and worn-out parts, rusty cans planted with vegetables and flowers. And there he found her indeed, where she was helping her grandmother hang out the laundry. She was real. And he saw the great difference in their ages. She was 12, he was over 30. And he knew that he would never be more than a friend of the family. But it was because of her mostly that he decided not to go to the capital, but to stay in that little godforsaken town in the middle of nowhere and become the director of its only hospital. And he visited the grandmother and the girl and became a friend of the family. Under the grandmother's vigilant eye, taught her multiplication tables. She called him tío, uncle. People wondered why he never married and remained a bachelor and why he made friends with this particular family. But anything more that could ever have happened was only in his imagination. And here was Esther Lucero, already in her adolescence, with a terrible gaping wound. Her grandmother, trembling, said she climbed the mango tree and slipped and fell off right onto the stake, the wooden stake where we tie the goose. And she had been skewered on that stake. Well, he mobilized all of his medical knowledge. He operated, he sutured, he transfused her with his own blood because they had the same blood type. He did everything he could. He gave her antibiotics, he had her an intravenous. Nothing was saving her life. Clearly her life was ebbing away and she had entered a coma. He had not left her bedside for a day and a half. He had not slept, he had not eaten. No one else was in the room at that point, and he was sitting at the foot of her bed. He rested his head on the edge of her bed and there fell suddenly into this deep sleep like a baby. And she was wandering in limbo, in coma. And so they met there in that no man's land of dream, where she clung to his hand and begged him not to let death take her so young. And he swore that he wouldn't abandon her. He wakened from that sleep with a sudden memory of something that had happened in the jungle during those years of war. It was the miracle that had saved the life of one compañero of his named Negro Rivas. He was a big, burly, cheerful man, always ready to help a companion, to sling a weaker comrade across his shoulders, to joke, to sing. He had suddenly fallen down a terrible great ravine, piercing himself on the rocks as he went down. It took his companions 20 minutes with ropes just to lower themselves down to where he was, and another 2 hours to wrestle him back up, bleeding all the way. When they saw him with the limited medical field supplies they had, he, the doctor, knew there wasn't that much he could do. His ribs were laid bare from front to back. He stitched him up as best he could. He applied what medicaments he had. And they improvised a stretcher and began carrying him through the jungle, but it was very apparent as he kept bleeding profusely that every jarring step shook more of the life out of him. Finally, when they were all exhausted, they stopped and stayed in one place for a few moments, and they felt eyes on them and looked. And from inside the bushes, there were 2 pairs of eyes of 2 of the Indians of a tribe that time had never reached. Perhaps one unsuccessful missionary had seen them once, so they weren't frightened of the people. And they motioned to the whole crew to follow them. They picked up Negro Rivas and followed these 2 men on a little hidden path to their village very close by. They motioned them to a hut where they put Negro Rivas down. Soon, there came out the curandero, the witch doctor of that particular village. He had already been told what was needed, and so he came in full regalia. He was decorated with feathers and with bones and with amulets strung around his neck, and he had already entered a healing trance, so his eyes were wild. And the comandante of the group wasn't about to let him do anything. He was frightened to even look at him. But Angel Sanchez, the doctor, said, "Look, there's nothing more we can do for him. Who knows, maybe he can help. If he does nothing more than help the man die in peace, it's better than what we can do." And so the men all moved back and let this man do his work. And Angel Sanchez remembered now what that was, and remembered that while the rest of the group stayed and helped Negro Rivas recover, because, in 2 hours he was sitting up and drinking hot liquid. By the next day, he had his appetite back, and by the next afternoon, he was taking his first steps around the camp. While they were accompanying Negro Rivas, he, Angel Sanchez, was following the witch doctor through the jungle, collecting these magical herbs that he had seen him use. He remembered all this in a flash, in much less time than it took me to tell it. And he went speeding out of the room, past the old grandmother who was reciting the rosary outside the door, and he said, "Keep praying, I'll be right back." He ran to his home, and he found the old trunk where he kept all the mementos of the war, of the revolution. And he dug around past the old beret, past the notebook of poems, past the old torn uniform, past the gun, and there in the bottom, wrapped in old papers, were these herbs from years ago. He grabbed them and he ran back to the hospital. He ran into the room and bolted the door behind him, and he began the process he had seen done. First, he took off his jacket. The grandmother and one of the nurses watched in astonishment as the director of their hospital proceeded to take off his shirt and his tie and his shoes and his undershirt and then his pants and then the rest, and he stood there naked as the day he was born. And then he began a dance. And into this dance, they could see him pour his life as if he was pouring all the energy of all the years he had been alive on this earth, from his infancy, from the moment he saw life until this moment. He lifted his knees to his chin, he flung his arms, he twirled, and he created a vortex of life around the girl. And when the time was right, he went and he took these herbs, he put them in a bowl, and he pounded them with his fist into a powder. And then they saw to his horror that he brought them over to the girl, and ignoring all the laws of asepsis, he spit into the bowl and made a paste and smeared it over her wound. By that time, everyone who was watching through the tiny window was wondering what to do, and had he been anyone but the director of the hospital, they wouldn't have hesitated to break down the bolted door and carry him away in a straitjacket. Finally, some hours later, they got the fireman, the fire chief, to do exactly that. They found him resting after a second round of dances. Well, they sent to the capital because they didn't know what to do with a director of the hospital who'd apparently taken leave of his senses. By the time the people from the capital arrived, the doctor was impeccably attired behind his desk. Esther Lucero was walking down the hall on the arm of her grandmother, healing very well. The commission from the capital didn't make any mention of the strange dance the doctor had done, but concentrated their inquiry on the nature of the magical herbs. And so they formed a commission to try and find this tribe in the jungle and find the curandero and find what herbs they were. Of course, they were not successful because the tribe had faded ever deeper into the forest. And eventually the group stopped trying to find an indigenous cure to fatal accidents. Esther Lucero grew up and married an unremarkable man and moved to the city, and now and then sent nostalgic postcards with terrible spelling errors back to the doctor. She continued to populate his dreams.